Joining us now is the beloved member of our BYU TV football crew, David Nixon, on the Deseret First Credit Union Hotline. David, welcome back to BYU Sports Nation. Always nice to see your face, and always nice to see that amazing jersey you have behind you.
There she is, the old Lindbacker right there.
The greatest linebacker in BYU football history, dare I say. Hey, David, it's not going to happen, but Pat Forty put out some interesting conference realignment scenarios based on pandemic and all of the hypothetical scenarios that could happen if college football went to a major shift. What aspects of Pat Forty's idea and that Rocky Mountain Conference with BYU and Utah and Colorado and Arizona State, among others, what do you like most about that?
Well, I'll tell you this, I'm a little torn on it, to be honest. I love the setup. I like the geographic nature of it where you're close to your opponents. I like that Utah's back in the division. You know, you have to spark up that rivalry. I like the two Arizona schools. I think they fit well. I don't love, as you guys know, I'm not a big fan of Laramie. Not a huge fan of Albuquerque. So throwing those guys back in the mix, not ideal. But, you know, I think it's actually pretty fun. I think it's pretty well balanced, frankly. And you look at the history with these schools, it's a pretty good time. With that being said, I'm torn because I feel like the downside is the fact that BYU, you look at BYU's schedule this year, they face 6 P5 opponents this year. Whereas if they were go to this type of format, you only have 4 with the two Arizona schools, Colorado and Utah. And so I think it depends. It's somewhat spoiled me in the sense that you get to play these P5 teams, you know, week in and week out. Then, of course, you know, this year's schedule, you sprinkle in Boise State, San Diego State. I mean, it's a solid schedule, top down. So I don't know. I think it's pretty fun. I do love. I think all BYU fans, frankly, all fans across the country would admit, similar to basketball, it's great in the sense that you have a shot at getting to the playoff. You're not one of these G5s like BYU currently is, where you know it takes almost a miracle to get into the playoff. In this scenario, BYU would have a great shot, and especially in this conference. I think this conference, it's not like you're facing, you know, the Washingtons and Oregons and USCs who are traditionally powerhouses. I think it's a pretty level playing field for this Rocky Mountain League. Once again, does it happen? Most likely not. But it's pretty fun to talk about here at the end of June.
Yeah, we're almost to July, so this is kind of what you get right now. But I found it fascinating, and you know, you touched on what you like, what you don't like, and you were talking about the fact that it does look like it's a conference that's not, you know, insurmountable. So how do you think BYU would fare annually in a conference that was made up like this?
Honestly, it reminds me of my Mountain Conference days when it was basically a 3-horse race with TCU, BYU, and Utah. And I would see probably the same here. I think, well, frankly, it'd probably be a little tougher. You throw Boise State in the mix. I think they'd be vying for that top spot. But it'd be difficult. I think there's a few games in there, just like in any conference, that's the bottom dwellers that I think BYU would do fine with. But that upper tier with the two Arizona schools, as we've seen, I mean, BYU goes, you know, head to head with those guys, but it's always a toss up. Of course, Utah's had BYU's number, and so could BYU flip the switch? Who knows? But Boise State's very competitive, and Colorado, they're kind of on the up and coming. So it's a pretty compelling league. I mean, you look across all the different leagues they put together. I think this Rocky Mountain is up there with one of the best. I mean, there are some. You look at the Sun Belt Conference with Alabama, Auburn, LSU. That's pretty daunting. Even the Southwest with A&M, Texas Tech. I mean, Oklahoma. That's a pretty solid conference as well. So pretty fun to look at. I spent some time going through and kind of same thing you're talking about, analyzing which ones are easy, which ones are hard, and they did a pretty good job of balancing it all out, frankly.
Quite honestly, the funniest part was hearing Alabama and Sun Belt in the same sentence.
Yeah, it doesn't seem right, does it?
No, it doesn't.
I think all Alabama fans saw this and just like almost want to throw up in their mouth, probably.
Yeah, talk about a major upgrade for the Sun Belt Conference. Good grief. David Nixon with us on BYU Sports Nation. We're discussing hypothetical conference realignment. Why? Because it's June, late June at that, okay? That's just what we do. David, this brings up a question about BYU's current status and independence. Now, essentially a decade later from making that decision, is BYU in a better position than they were as an athletic department 10 years after they defected from the Mountain West Conference?
I think so. I think so. I once again, there's been people who've been very vocal about going back to the Mountain West Conference, and I've been a strong proponent of staying in independence. I just don't think the Mountain West was ever the answer. And I've mentioned this before, but it comes down to recruiting. If Kalani Sitake walks into a kid's house who's also being recruited by Utah, an in-state kid that's a big recruit, all Kyle Whittingham would have to say is, listen, Pac-12 or Mountain West, which one do you want? At least now Kalani can walk into the house and say, okay, yeah, you got the Pac-12, but we're in an independent. And because of that, we play on the biggest stages against the biggest teams, week in and week out, on ABC, ESPN, and you have this exposure. And so I think just recruiting alone, the independence is a huge win. And listen, BYU still gets a taste of the Mountain West. You still get to play the San Diego States, the Boise States of the world. And so it's working out. Yeah, you're not vying for a championship, but I've also said this before. I've got 2 Mountain West Conference championship rings that nobody really cares about. I mean, it was fun to win them. And of course, I have great memories with my teammates. But if I were to wear those around town, nobody's going to say, wow, you won a Mountain West Conference championship. They're just not that big of a deal. And so to go compete in the Mountain West Conference right now, it's just kind of whatever, right? I mean, I think everyone wants to be in the P5 league. And so if you're not going to be the P5, I think the next best is independence, where, like I said, you get to play Wisconsin's, Tennessee's, USC's of the world, and you get to play them on the biggest stages. I mean, ABC, and you get the chance to be seen and get that exposure. So I think it was the right move. And of course, listen, I want to be in a conference. I think all of us want to be in a P5 conference. But until that happens, independence is your ship. You got to ride it.
All right, so let's look at this scenario that Pat Forty has put out there. So looking at this conference, I think for the most part, I only made 2 changes. Spencer and I, in the last segment, talked about our ideal conferences and what it would look like. And mine looks pretty similar to what this is. Now, I'm like you. The trip to Wyoming doesn't look too appealing. Wyoming was out of that scenario for me, and as was New Mexico. And I had San Diego State in and Nevada in replacing those. But otherwise, I think it's a pretty ideal conference realistically. What's your ideal conference look like for BYU?
I mean, ideal, I would be to cherry pick all the Pac-12, maybe cherry pick a couple of the Southwest and kind of switch it up a little bit. But at the same time, listen, we've seen what independence, having a top-bottom brutal schedule, can do. Injuries pop up, fatigue sets in, and BYU struggled late in the season. And so you do have to balance out these schedules. Yeah, it'd be great to have power teams at the top and to have the whole conference full of those type of groups. But you've got to have some teams where it's more of a rest week, week in and week out. And that's something we had with the Mountain West. I mean, we did play, Wyoming. We did play New Mexico when they struggled. And sure enough, the starters, you were out by third quarter, and you're able to rest and not get any more dinged up. And so, for me, if I had my ideal, it would have USC, Washington, Oregon, take some Texas Tech, maybe Oklahoma, throw them in the mix. BYU's in there. That'd be fun, but it would also be really brutal. So, listen, I think this Rocky Mountain, like we said earlier, I think top to bottom, it's pretty solid.
David Nixon on BYU Sports Nation. David, I have been, and Jeremy and Jason and I have been talking about this around BYU broadcasting, but we're looking at the experience that BYU brings back with a majority of upperclassmen that have played a lot of football. And then we look at ESPN and they say, BYU is probable to win, I don't know, maybe 6 games this year. 7 would be a good season. We're starting to feel like with as many upperclassmen as BYU has, and if Zach Wilson is healthy and has had a full healthy offseason, should we not, even though the schedule is harder, expect more out of this specific BYU group? Are you on board for expecting at least 8 wins for BYU football this season?
8 wins is lofty, but I do expect a big season from this Cougar team. And I think a lot of it has to do with the guys that came back. When you got Kyra Stung on defense, the mainstay, the nose guard who swallows up blocks, as well as you got Bushman on the offensive side of the ball, decided to come back. He's your big target as well. When you got those 2 big guys coming back and you throw in, like you said, a veteran team, and not necessarily veteran by senior, juniors and seniors, but more veteran in the sense that you got a lot of guys that have played. Because the last few years, BYU has been bitten by the injury bug, you've got a lot of guys that have a lot of game reps. And so with that being said, you got to think that going into this year, that they know what to expect. And when you have those live game reps, that's completely different. And like I said, you've had a lot of guys that have had those. And so for me, it's a team that's got to come together. This COVID situation has made it tough because you're not there together with each other. Hopefully they're getting working on the sides. But I expect big things from this team. And I think you guys would probably agree, from top to bottom of this year's schedule, I think this is probably the most difficult schedule in Independence. I think from top to bottom, when you look at just week in and week out, it's a tough schedule. Yeah, you don't have maybe all the ranked teams per se, but man, you throw in Minnesota and the first four are all P5 teams, and you end the season with Stanford, you got Boise State. I mean, it's a solid schedule. So they're going to have to be prepared. And I think if anything they've learned, this team has learned under Kalani Sitake, is you've got to stay healthy, and you got to keep that consistency throughout the season. You can't let it drop off. And so I think consistency is the key word for this year.
Specifically on the defensive side, we've been hearing a lot about Kalani Sitake taking more of a role on the defensive side of things. How do you expect that to materialize on the field this year?
Well, yeah, Kalani's going to be more involved. And I think what happens with that is I think they realize they've got to get back to their roots. And the thing that Kalani did best as defensive coordinator at his stops at Utah and Oregon State is pressure. He loves to bring pressure. And that's something that obviously last year, because of personnel and injuries, they couldn't bring the pressure they wanted to. And so I expect this year to see a completely different defense, a defense that flies around and makes plays. I will say this, the benefit of having a veteran secondary, when you got Troy Warner, Chris Wilcox, these guys on the back end, is now you can afford to take shots with your linebackers, blitz them off the edges, blitz them up the A-gaps, bring the defensive ends off the edge, do some games, do some twists, because now you have a secondary that you know that you can kind of leave them out to dry a little bit. You can leave them out to hang and let them go man-to-man on the back end and bring pressure on the front end. But the problem with last year, because of injuries early on in camp and early on in the season, they didn't have that luxury. And so that's one thing. If BYU can stay healthy, and I know it's a big if, that's something that they've struggled with. But if throughout this fall camp, if they can stay healthy in these first few games, I think you'll see a drastically different BYU defense. I don't see you any more of this drop eight. Maybe you see in a few different scenarios. But I think Kalani this year is going to be all in on bringing the heat and getting some pressure on opposing quarterbacks, because we saw what happened last year. They got picked apart in certain games. Certain games it worked. Certain games, Utah State, USC, the drop eight worked. But other games, it didn't. Offenses were able to pick them apart, and it obviously resulted in losses. So I'm excited for this defense. And once again, if they can stay healthy, I think you'll see a completely new defense.
David, I'll leave you with this stat as we say goodbye. BYU is looking at a potential of as many as 19 or 20 returning starters that are upperclassmen. So maybe that makes you feel better about the pursuit of 8 wins.
Yeah, listen, it makes me feel great, frankly. And I think a lot of it also is these ESPN writers just look at BYU's record last year. Even though you have a lot of returning stars, they could probably just write it up to be, well, they weren't very good last year, so those same guys are returning. They're probably not going to be great this year. But when you look at Zane Anderson, a lot of these guys that were registering last year that were significant contributors in years prior, it makes you excited. So I'm excited for this season. Hopefully it happens. I think it will. Might be a modified type season with how we can view it. I don't know if they'll allow all 60,000 fans in the stadiums, but we'll figure it out. And I just hope, regardless, that we have football. I think there's too much money in this sport, frankly, to not play it. And they'll find a way if they have to. No fans, and we just watch it on BYU TV and have a good time.
Hey, take it from the greatest linebacker to ever wear number 43 at BYU. David, great to catch up with you, man. We'll talk again soon.